Hello everyone, welcome to Into the IP Address Rabbit Hole. This is part one of a Tradecraft series on IP addresses. This is more suited towards the junior, senior, principal skill levels of the field than apprentice, though it's still appropriate for them if they want to delve into this. This just starts the beginning of looking past the surface, if you will, of analysis and understanding that can be gained from looking at IP addresses. And in this case, we're going to touch on one of a couple of different elements of Tradecraft in relation to IP addresses. And this is important primarily because IP addresses are one of those indicators that we see and work with frequently in our industry. Whether you're a cybersecurity SOC analyst or engineer, or you're a threat intelligence or threat researcher, or whatsoever your cybersecurity position is named, you will deal with IP addresses. And there are different ways to look at them. There's different levels of analysis. This looks beyond the surface, the very beginning level analysis, and gets into more of the kind of down the rabbit hole, if you will, or in the weeds, if you prefer, level of analysis that you can do to help understand the position and organization of an IP address in relation to its neighbors and how it exists within the route. So while this type of analysis falls more into the threat intelligence or threat researcher side of cybersecurity, it's still relatively relevant to SOC analyst, SOC engineer, or something similar. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this. So enough on the first page here, let's jump right into it. A friend of mine really likes rabbits, and so that's kind of part of the theme here. As I was thinking of this and laying out the slides, I thought it was quite funny, frankly, and I wanted to pay tribute to him by putting in a little bunny inside of the slides. So watch the jumping bunny. You'll see that they will point out and progress as we move forward and talk about different things that are related to going down the rabbit hole to find out information about IP addresses. So what we have here on the screen here is kind of a throwback to some of the earlier lectures and whiteboard series that we did, where I talked about, from the IP address, one of the elements that you will look for, one of the components that you will collect will be its CIDR, which is the route that it uses to understand how to be found on the internet. It's a kind of a border gateway protocol topic, which I'm going to skip at the moment because it's more of a complex topic than I want to touch on it right now. If any of this sounds unfamiliar, or if you don't remember the basic set of components that we defined should be collected, that was covered in a few lectures and whiteboard series before this. So if you're fuzzy, or you're drawing a blank, please go and review those. I'll pause for a moment, and I want you to pause the video and jump to that. There are links that are relevant in the description. You can jump to those, or you can go to ones that are more familiar to you. Okay, regardless, and hopefully you've had a chance to review at this point, one element of collection discussed was, again, the CIDR, or the route. What we're going to do is look a little bit past just the route and look at the IP block that an IP address may exist in. I say may because part of this analysis, what I'm going to introduce this stage here, is to see if an IP block is in play. One of the reasons we do this as an analyst is as we look at IP addresses, one of the things we need to do besides figure out if we need to block it and take immediate actions, whether we need to whitelist or blacklist or whatever it might be, is looking at that IP address from the view of what does it tell me about the attacker who's using it and their tradecraft? What does it tell me about how much resources they expended to utilize that IP address? And more questions like that. There's a list of questions that understanding an IP address, especially if it is part of a block of IP addresses, can tell you when it comes to how many resources the attacker expended. And it's something that you might want to track. Again, this is why this is more on the threat research or threat intelligence side of the house in relation to a series of IP addresses that you are watching, especially if you're seeing phishing or malicious activity out of them. If it's a one-off single IP address, that represents one possible variable. If it's a block of consecutive or close to consecutive IP addresses, then it represents a different kind of investment on the side of the attacker. And that's interesting because it can tell us how much they're invested in attacking us, which is kind of an idea here, because they may be in your top 10, top 3, whatever level of risky things that you're keeping in mind. You're keeping at the top of hopefully your CISO's fingertips as part of your security program. If you, as a side note, if you're not doing this, you should have a top 3, top 10 or something similar that is your top hazards, your top threats that you're worried about, that you track. Now, when you're in the threat researcher side, I understand that you have a much bigger smorgasbord of actors that you're looking at, and that's fine. You'll have your favorites out of that regardless, but this is a piece of determining the resourcing and focus of that particular attacker, as well as understanding to a certain extent how big their organization is based on what you can find from knowing how many IP blocks that they juggle and maintain. And that should hopefully make sense as we go on. But let's talk about this in a little bit more detail first. So in most cases, when you look at a CIDR, it's going to have resolved to a /24 or bigger. So it'll be /24, /23, /22, something along those lines. And depending on where you go to get that information, whether you go to ARN or you go somewhere else, they will eventually get it down to a /24. Because /24 is kind of like the native Class C network. It's the easiest thing for majority of companies that own networks to route. And in Border Gateway Protocol, there's a cost on their side to route things, and that's kind of important. That's again a separate lecture. Touch on that if you haven't looked at it. I just want to say that there's a cost there, and so what occurs on the organization side that owns that IP address space is they will bundle smaller groups /26s, /28s, /30s. They'll bundle all those up a lot of times into a /24 so they can manage them a little bit easier. That's why when you look at the CIDR, many times you'll get a /24, sometimes you get a /16, whatever it might be. Those have been bundled. There's a lot more ranges underneath there, IP blocks that are owned by different people or leased by different people that we're interested in, and that's why we do this kind of analysis. And so we want to get the most common CIDR, what is normally being routed, so that's understandable because they're basically passing traffic down into these smaller IP blocks, and they're going to help us understand how to identify them, because if it's a /16, it's a different size than a /24, and it will change where the boundaries are to look for different ranges, because we're basically going to play around with subnetting here to try to figure out what IP blocks are owned by people. Now, as a reminder, routes are subdivided as needed by the owner. So I mentioned earlier /24s are kind of common, but it wouldn't be unusual for like a /24 to be subdivided. And here I've broken it up into two /27s, 26 and a 25. And these would be the edges or the boundaries. And the edges are something we're going to be very, very interested in here soon. As you see here under the network piece, the edge here is a 0 and a 31 because you have to have that network and broadcast. They also have to have a gateway in there too, and we'll talk on about it here. That takes up a third space in many cases inside of a net range that might be owned by someone. So in this, say, /27 here, the 0 and the 31, you can't get away from those being taken up. But for the gateway, it might be this 0.1 or it might be this 30, depending on who is enforcing the gateway kind of rules. They might say, no, it has to be an even number. So if you like have an AT&T static block of IPs, for example, they define that you absolutely have to have an even number for your gateway. So that would make it almost in every case the 30, though you could make it pretty much any number you wanted to. It's just odd that you don't have it at the end extents, the beginning or the end of your range of IPs that you've purchased. They may or may not give you a choice, is kind of where I'm going here. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this. Now, so to look at IP blocks, to get an idea, one of the things we're going to do to understand ownership and to understand underneath, say, that /24, how big a smaller division of it might be, we're going to look for the edges. And the edges are really, really important because they help us define the subdivisions. And it's also important to understand, before you start looking for edges, that you know how blocks of IP addresses are sold. Now, in this case, when I, as a person or a criminal, goes out to purchase a block of IP addresses, they either buy one IP address or they tend to buy them in groups that make sense, like 4, 8, 16, and so forth. And you can see why in the table over here on the right, they might pick one certain size over another. It doesn't really matter whether it's a ClearNet, say, legitimate provider of IP addresses, or it's a criminal one. They will pretty much follow the same guidelines, with, of course, an exception here or there. But in the majority of cases, they will buy a 4 or an 8 or 16 or some kind of block of IPs of that size. If they're going to buy one-offs, they'll buy one-offs. And occasionally those will cluster close together, but in most cases that won't happen. because of the way the owner is dividing things out and selling them off piecemeal. And so when looking at the edges, you're looking at a static block. You want to try to figure out where things might be. In this case, I've taken a second example and I've subdivided a /24 route, which, if you recall, will have from 0 to 254. And in this case, you're only going to have so many things that are usable. And I've included the gateway this time just to show you that the gateway might be this number. It could just as easily be over here and be at the odds, but it's a good example. And these would be your actual active IPs that you could do something with: hosting, malware download, phishing from, that kind of stuff. So you want to find those edges. And the gateway is either the second to the last or, again, the first usable IP address. That's just the kind of rule of thumb. It's not a definitive thing, but keep it in mind because it does consume an IP address. And so when you're looking at phishing, let's say in this example, we've identified, I don't know, capital One phishing here. And so that's our phishing number one. When you're looking at the IP address, and just for simplicity's sake, this could be the first three octets can be anything. It doesn't really matter for the example. All I'm saying is the last octet is a .21, .22, .23, .24, and so on, all the way through down to 32 there. And what we're looking for here is, let's say this was phishing that happened against our organization. We see phishing on .23, .24, .25, nothing on .26, but do see something on .28. And then there's no activity in the other parts of this IP range. That's a kind of typical pattern. And so what we might do with rule number one is look for the edges. So in this case, we've got 4 IP addresses, 3 of which are consecutive. There's a gap between 25 and 28. I see I missed 27, so just assume 27's there. 27 also has no activity, and so we have a gap there. If this was one range, one IP block, a /30 is too small, right? A /29 is kind of unlikely because activity begins on 23 and ends on 28. That does not make it a good candidate for the edges, because if you remember how those break down, /29 won't break down that way. So the most likely candidate then is a /28 that would start on 16 and would end on 31, with IPs .17 through .30 being the most usable ones. And so we could imply that because of the consecutiveness of the phishing and the edges of what the most likely IP block is, they may have purchased a /28 in order to perform this. And we could look at things over time, go back up to 60 days or move forward from this point in time and kind of keep an eye on there and understand not only did they buy this, say, /28 in that bucket of IP addresses, but from there, say, okay, how long did they maintain it? Because again, we want to answer questions not only of this is all owned by them, because then I could block that whole range of IPs if I wanted to, or I could do further research on them, but also if they allocated and purchased that IP block, they may reuse it. They may use those IPs for something else. There might be other parts in here. Plus, that's a cost. I can go out and determine the cost for /28 in the darknet market and figure out, okay, if the criminals acquired this through a service, how much would they have paid? If they did it directly, how much would that have cost? If you're curious, it's about $20 to $25 an IP address. There's not really a discount if you buy in block. So if they did buy that, you're looking at a couple $100 there, $150 or so for like a 30-day expanse. It might be, so if they kept it for 2 or 3 months, you can kind of calculate how much investment they had there and also how much time they're spending in managing this. Because that space might be used for phishing now, but it might become active for something later. And so it just starts your level of analysis. I'll stop there. There's multiple levels of analysis. This is just one component where we're looking at finding the edges and understanding how many IP blocks or how much of an IP block someone might have acquired. Let's do another example, this one a little harder. Now, if you look here, I'm using the tilde to represent there's large expanses of IPs there where there's either legitimate or no activity. Now, if you look at this, there's a .92 with phishing on it, but then there's a .102, and everything in between is either legitimate or there was no activity. And the biggest problem here is that legitimate. When you see legit activity, it makes it hard to say that an IP block is owned by a criminal, that they have leased that, because typically they don't then let it out to someone else to do legitimate activity. Folks get a legitimate IP and they stick with it in a kind of rule of thumb here. So if you see legitimate activity, then that kind of starts nixing whether there's consecutive blocks of IPs together. And you might be asking, well, what's legitimate activity? A real business hosting their site there, a campaign that's using some kind of election service that is reputable and real, has their their website there. Things that even recently spun up but are legitimate might be there. Sales, news, things like that are not themselves or not linked to phishing, malware, or negative activity, or even misinformation tend to be legitimate. You may not like them. They may have a topic you don't care for. It can even be pornography. It's still legitimate activity to a certain extent, depending on how you view that topic. But it's definitely not malware, phishing, or anything like that. So if you have information like that in between, it makes it difficult under rule number 1 to say, okay, they own an IP block. What may have occurred here is they acquired individual IPs at different times and were given, as they were handed out, IPs that move forward or back and forth. It's kind of hard to see. You'd have to look at the date activity started in each one of those to timeline out and understand when they may have acquired each one of those IPs and had activity on them. But it is, again, a harder example. In this case, our rule number 1 evaluation would be negative because of that legitimate or no activity in between, the phishing. Let's do another hard one. So in this case, we have similar ideas. We have legit activity before our .113. And we have legit activity between 113 and 116. That's a problem. That helps break that up. That, again, might make this negative, but post that from 116 and on 119 and then 121 and 122 and then all the way to 135, we have phishing activity. It's 2 different phishing types. We have phishing number 1, phishing number 2. And if it isn't obvious, I've made those simplistic on purpose. Mainly because I didn't want to get into phishing names and kits and all that other stuff, because that again is a different type of analysis. But for now, just know that there's 2 types of phishing going on there. Let's say Capital One and Bank of America, right? 2 different brands, but kind of the same thing going on. They're trying to fish for credentials. That legitimate activity is a negative hint between 113 and 116, but then you see consecutive or near consecutive activity past that. That gives you kind of edges to look at. And speaking of edges, before I miss my point up there, legitimate activity on the other side of 113 and legitimate activity on the other side of 135 gives you kind of an edge to start in. Kind of tells you might have a boundary to look in. So this could be a /26, but that legit activity between on 114 or 115, that's a negative influencer there that says that might not be possible. And so you'd have to use Rule 2 and Rule 3 to continue to evaluate this. But the fact that there's phishing there, especially when there's phishing number 2, could indicate that it's not a /26 but a /29, the 121 and 122 there, with some kind of isolated activity on 116. Given that there's 2 different phishing activities here, even though they're branded, they're different brands, they're both banking, it still could be 2 different entities that are working in the same IP address space. You see this a lot in Ukrainian and Russian IP ranges that are constantly turned over, or ones that are in the various European countries and even here in the US. If you're curious, about 25 to 30% of most malicious activity is set here in the US easily, sometimes upwards of 50 depending on what you measure. So it's kind of messy. That's why I don't do geo approximation most of the time, but there are certain IP ranges that just see so much turnover. This could be a picture out of any one of them, and it would be difficult to keep an eye on and define, in some cases, the IP blocks that someone might own. But in this case, you might imply that there's a /29 in there owned by at least one individual for a period of time, and then there might be isolated incidents of phishing and where people have grabbed either single IPs or something that's similar. Now, there's not just one rule. I implied there's a rule number 2 and 3, and let's talk about number 2 here. So number 2, if you can't figure it out from just looking at the edges, the second thing you can do is evaluate the activity on the IP addresses that you're looking at for identical or linked activity. Identical looks the same. Linked is close but not necessarily identical. So in this case, Capital One phishing followed by something similar. So we might use Bank of America, we might use Wells Fargo, right? It's banking phishing, banking branded phishing. That could be enough to say that it is linked activity, especially if it's sitting all in the same IP addresses. There could be linkages there, or if it's all the same kit with just a different brand. There's many other ways you can make a link as far as having linked analysis and linked phishing activity or malware activity. Just as a note, the average activity for a malicious IP is 60 days or less. That kind of came out of 2020 stats that recently were published. 2019, it was right around 58 days, and 2018 it was 61, so we saw down and then back up. The idea there is that you really have a 2-month life cycle, and while I'm on the topic, it takes about the same amount of time to actually hit open source feeds. So if you're relying on open source feeds to do your matching, they're 60 days behind in most cases, and the activity for a malicious IP is 60 days. Doesn't mean they won't be helpful, it just means that they're always behind. That's something to keep in mind. Doesn't mean that private feeds are necessarily better. I don't have a way to evaluate those, but I do know that there's a lag, definitely, and there's a catch-up time. So some feeds are better than others. You just have to find one that's well suited for your environment, that you can personalize and has all the context that makes sense for you to use to block, whitelist, blacklist, etc. So my point here is keep your correlation in this time frame, about 60 days or so, when you're looking at activities, so that you don't get too far out of range. So if you're looking at a January, February, but you see activity in November, discount that at least initially until you can see for sure that activity across all of them extend in the same time frame. Then you might reconsider. Okay, let's do another example. So here's rule number 2 example. So in this case, we have identical or near identical activity identified on 9 IPs in the same route from 131 down to 139 there. So they meet the edge and consecutive rule in number 1. We might look at them and say, okay, this is highly likely to be a /28. Kind of starts on 128, ends on 143, which fits the range. 140 has legitimate activity, is kind of like, that may not be quite true. But still, it strongly signals that this is one block. It could just be that there's 2 /29s or some other kind of combination going on, but you can then count it out and do investment. Worst case, you would count each IP that they have and then use a round figure of about $25 to figure out their resource investment and understanding of it, especially over time. So if they had it for 9 months, you could kind of calculate it out and understand how much that particular attacker may have invested to have ownership of this. And if it isn't obvious, when I mentioned ownership in IP blocks, we're implying that they went and they grabbed that from a service or directly. They're not taking those over. They're not co-opting something that already exists that somebody else is paying for. This is something they're paying out of pocket for, if you will. There's a different kind of analysis to look at co-op or takeover activity, and it has a different fingerprint and pattern to it. So rule number 3, I won't do too many more of number 2 just because it's pretty straightforward. Rule number 3 is looking at the name server records, and in some cases the glue. If you're not familiar with that term, if you define an authoritative DNS server, so mydomain.com, if I wanted my own name servers, I'm like ns1.mydomain.com. Okay, I'm defining my own name server, in which case I'm defining an authoritative name server for my domain. I have to provide glue, or else you could potentially get into circular or recursion queries and then just spin forever. And so they don't like that, and especially out there, the authorities that run the root servers, especially that run the internet, they don't like that at all, and so they'll push back and not route things if you don't provide an authoritative DNS server. So if you're going to create that and you're going to have glue and you're a criminal, you're leaving behind records for us to follow, and that's awesome when we see that. It's not the norm, however, which is why we look at name server records more often than not, as you will see in this next example. So in this case, we're looking at, again, the IP address, it doesn't matter, but .12, 13, my tilde shows a jump. In this case, there's no legit activity, it's all no activity. But I have different sets of name servers defined. So name server group number 1 is custom, and I see that there's glue out there on 3 out of 5 domains. So I have a custom name server set, and it's being applied on 3 of those 5 domains that are sitting on that .12, that .12 IP address. And that's interesting because it indicates ownership. It indicates, because you can't just take somebody's name servers and have them route for you. It doesn't work that way. You're not authoritative except on the things that you announce for in your zone file. That's the whole point of being authoritative. So if I'm using a name server, an authoritative name server that's a custom name server on a different domain and I'm saying it's authoritative, then I'm indicating that it has the authority, it has the zone file, it has the authoritative announcement for that domain. And that's very important because it automatically implies ownership. And we can use that to look for IP blocks, is what we're saying here. In this case, number 1 is on 12, number 2 is on 13. Now those are the default name servers, so that's why I have them in green, they're separate. We don't know about 14, 15, 16, or 17, there's no activity on them. and I've chosen to skip over them at the moment. They could be default name server something else, but it's not important to our example. 18 has name server 1 again on all 6 domains, again implying ownership. So not only if we were doing domain analysis, we'd know that that's a connection right there between all those domains. Name server 2 comes up again on 23, and even though all these are using malware, there's default name servers basically on 2 of the IP addresses, and then on the rest of them we have a first set name server number 1, and then we have name server number 3 here that showed up, and it's authoritative for 7 out of 9. Now, just to be clear in my example, when I say 7 out of 9, the other 2 are these default name servers completely. So same thing here. 3 out of 5 use name server number 1, and the other 2 use name server number 2 as their cluster. And then down here on 33, we have name server 1 and 2, and name server number 3, that were defined for 11 out of 11 domains. Now, the reason that's important is, even though, name server number 1 connected to malware and phishing, awesome. Okay, we know that these are probably a group together. The fact that number 1 and number 2 are also tied together makes number 3 kind of grow into the same group. So we can bundle name server group number 1 and name server group number 3 together and say that there's a relationship there that's likely the same entity, even though the name servers are differently named. Now, because there's malware here, and we also have default name server assignments on these IP addresses, we can imply a connection. We can infer that there's a connection there based on the facts we're seeing. That this block probably is all a singular block owned by one person or one group. Excuse me, didn't mean to highlight that. And so rule number 1 is kind of inconclusive. I'm going to jump around a little here, but it doesn't exclude a /28, right? It's inconclusive because we can't see the edges clearly enough. But number 2 hints at a relationship between all IPs and points to a /28, so it kind of supports that this is all owned by one individual as a block. Rule number 3 completely implies that based on the way the name servers are set up and their connections. The way authoritative name servers function, by defining ownership this way, it tells us that the domains and the activity here is linked to these name servers. And if these name servers coexist together, they are linked. I don't like the wording of guilty by association because it's one of those fallacies out there. You can't paint everybody with the same brush just because they're standing next to each other. But if you both commit the same crime, or you're both in the same location committing the same crime, you can imply definitely a relationship there that isn't used on the GBA shield. In this case, it's legit that there's malware and it's resolving with name server 1 and name server 3 cluster. Now, you might ask, well, how could both be there? In this case, we're saying name server number 1, that group is 2 name servers, NS1, NS2 at something or another, myexample.com. You can have up to 10 name servers on a domain. That's the cap. And it's not unusual to have more than one there. Having both groups present implies a relationship there. They're all there. One of them will be authoritative, and that might be something that switches. That could be a tactic that's being employed. That's a big topic I'm going to skip at the moment. We'll talk about it in a later lecture or a whiteboard discussion, but there's reasons why you would play with your name servers and kind of jostle them around and switch who's authoritative and who's not. It has a lot to do with evading defensive measures and also obscuring your tracks. And so I'll just keep it at that. In this case, we could use both rules 1, 2, and 3 and say, okay, very likely or not that this /28 IP block is owned by an entity. Now, whether it's, and again, I kept malware kind of generic as well on purpose, whether it's all one, or this is a service of which a couple people are taking advantage of. In the example of a botnet, there might be 5 people behind the botnet, but the botnet's activity might be all here in this one IP block. Again, I want to know this because of resourcing and understanding of investment and activity. And it could be as simple as, okay, now that I know that an IP block is owned by a particular threat actor that I want to stop, I might block all of those, or I might put all those on a watch. I might threat hunt for all those IP addresses just in case I miss them. Or I might do further research on those and look at each name servers, and the ones that aren't tied together, I'd go chase them down to see what they're connected to, because typically there is reuse. There's a finite number of resources out there for them to employ, especially in the IPv4 space, and so it can cause collisions that they may or may not expect. that can give away their tracks and trail of who they use, or themselves in some cases. So at this point, I'm going to pause. There's a lot in this that we're talking about with just IP blocks. And this is part one. So when we do part two, we'll dig a little deeper into some other things we can do with IP addresses and routing and IP blocks to understand how an attacker is doing not only their tradecraft and their business, but like I said earlier, to a certain extent, how much money and resources they're investing. Because there is a level of management that is brought into play when you have to manage 15 IP addresses, 18 IP addresses, 50 IP addresses over managing one. And that level of investment is not only a cost, but also a person to a certain extent. It takes a certain amount of time. And when we get into the attribution track, you will see that the more resources you can define are being employed by a threat actor group, the more you can define more clearly how many people are active in that group and at what level. Who's in charge, who is being delegated down to, who takes care of some of the practical things, who handles certain roles, who's dual-hatted. All that starts coming to light the more you can observe of their activities. So the more we can tie in, even if it is speculative at the beginning, you can use that to make assumptions and then reinforce those with facts till you can turn those into actual true facts themselves. But you have to start somewhere. And sometimes all you begin with is an IP and then an IP block, and then you start spidering out and understanding all the connections there and then tie it to other activity, because there is a planning cycle and a life cycle to a person acting in the threat attacker field. And just like there is on our side for the cybersecurity side of the house, there is a life cycle to a person's skill, their job, how many assets, how many resources they have in their hands, etc., etc. And we'll get into that as we move into these lectures. But for now, take the time, review this again, ask questions or post comments if you have them. This is really just a tiny part of determining an IP block from a CIDR. When you can see an IP address, whether it's phishing, malware, or something else, and you look at it, you look at the CIDR, you take that route, and you start going, okay, is this part of a greater block? Now, I will be free to say in many cases the answer is no. You run the 3 rules, and there are a few other ones that are for off cases, and you look for those, and you say, no, this is probably not a block. And that's fine too. This is just a way to start determining resourcing, like I said, and other elements. But it's important to run this step. Not something that you want a junior to do, a apprentice to do, and maybe in some cases not a junior. It's not necessarily something that junior would be focused on because it may take them more time. This is something that a senior or principal might pull in and go, okay, I'm really interested on this IP's activity. Let me look at the CIDR, let me look at the IP block, let me then check the neighborhood and kind of expand out to understand ownership and activity here and see if there's one or more attackers at play. Those are different layers of analysis. That's why in the beginning I said this is not necessarily an apprentice topic, but definitely one for the junior, senior, and principal side of the house. So hopefully you've enjoyed this lecture. If you have, please give it a like. If you like what you're seeing and you're following the channel, please subscribe to us. We will have much, much more of this to talk about. There is literally hundreds of hours of this queued up and ready to post as soon as I can knock out the time to get it all done. But until then, please enjoy what's there. Ask me questions. If you have things that you want covered, please post those either on the GitHub or shoot a comment to the channel, and I'll take the time to respond to you. Thank you.